We are now live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our difficult discussions number 4. I am Dr. Megan Miller, and I am pleased to welcome Cailey, Rodgers, and Michael Crosby for tonight's discussion. The purpose of difficult discussions is to bring together people with different perspectives and different identities to share their perspectives on a topic that is typically considered taboo to discuss, seen as controversial, and or is well accepted but maybe should involve more critical analysis and discussion. The format for these events is as follows. None of the panelists will directly respond to anything the other panelists say, except in part 3. In part 1, each person will briefly share any identities they are comfortable sharing and indicate why they wanted to discuss this topic. In part 2, each person will provide about a 5 to 10 minute explanation of their history and perspectives with the topic. In part 3, each panelist will briefly reflect on one thing said by one of the panelists to share an aha moment or something they hadn't considered before. And in part 4, each panelist will share a closing thought about the topic. This might be an action item, a key point they want listeners to carry with them, etc. And the views and opinions expressed in this difficult discussions video are those of each individual person and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any affiliated company or professional organization. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for this discussion. Please remember that each of the individuals sharing within this discussion are sharing their own personal stories and perspectives, and we expect everyone to be treated with respect, empathy, compassion, and civility. We will do our best to monitor the chat, and anyone who is engaging in a manner that is not respectful of the discussion, that does not demonstrate a commitment to listening to learn, sharing perspectives, and or is focused on making people wrong, will be removed from the chat. So now that I have all of the lovely things over that we have to announce about the difficult discussions, how are you both doing, Michael and Cailey?
Fine, thank you.
Doing well, thanks.
Good. Okay. So the first question is really just like an introduction to see who we're talking to tonight and why we're talking about what we're talking about. So the question 1 is briefly introduce yourself with any identities that you would like to share and tell us why this topic. Does anyone want to go first?
Okay. I'm Michael Crosby. I'm autistic. I come from an autistic family. I have an autistic family. I got an autistic wife and 5 autistic kids. I've been a special ed teacher and an autism advocate for the last 20, 25 years or so. And I've worked in the, as a leader in the autistic community for most of that time, helping running online and offline autistic groups. And just being fond of wisdom and experience.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to go next or do you want me to go?
I'll go. I'm Cailey. I am a neurodivergent autistic behavior analyst. I have been in the field of behavior analysis and special education for about 15 years. I'm currently a first-year doctoral student in special education at the University of Oregon. And I'm interested in discussing research because I think it's really important to move the field forward and improve services for kids.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. I didn't know that you were in Oregon. I don't know why. I don't know where I thought you were, but I just didn't know.
I've been all over. I'm from Ohio and I lived in New York and LA and now I'm in Oregon.
Wow. You've been all over.
Yeah.
Well, I am a cisgender woman, white, neurotypical, heterosexual. I have a 4.5-year-old son. He'll be 5 in February, which is just wild to think about. And I'm a behavior analyst as well. For me, I put this topic down for difficult discussions because when I was obtaining my PhD, I started to develop some questions and criticisms about how research is conducted. And over the past year, especially, I've identified quite a few gaps in areas where we as behavior analysts can do better and how we conduct and consume research. I talked about this actually a little bit on the Behavioral Observations podcast a few years ago. It was like the last episode that I did with Matt back in, I think, 2018 or so. And I feel like I never get to really talk about it in enough detail with people. So I'm really looking forward to today. I probably have like hours of content on this. So basically I put it down just really, there's just so many concerns that I think need to be addressed. And I think it'll just be the tip of the iceberg that we talk about tonight. So, okay. So our next question is, what is each person's history with research? Feel free to touch on anything relating to research. You can talk about conducting research, reading and applying research, participating in research, advantages and disadvantages, and the way research is conducted, interpreted, and applied. Really anything you want relating to research. So does somebody want to go first? And if not, I can. I just don't want to
I
always.
went first last time.
Okay.
All right. Do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first?
Because he went first last time. I can go, I guess.
Okay.
So I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to research with autistic students and autistic people is that in university settings, the disability studies research and literature and folks who are really aligned with disability justice issues are doing research in one silo. And those who are in like the helping professions, education, social work, OTPT, SLP, ABA, all psych, all of the helping professionals who are working with autistic people are in a different silo and they don't work together. So what we know that autistic people prefer and what people would prefer in terms of like outcomes and what they're looking for in their life, all of that information is happening and being gathered right now for the most part in like the disability studies area and not in the schools of education and ABA and social work, et cetera. And so a lot of the criticisms are related to things like outcome measures. Like in ABA, we tend to focus on things that are norm referenced and really deficits focused. And is it possible for us to instead focus on accommodating and more of a strength focused paradigm? So I would like to see personally that kind of bridge built and more communication and research happening collaboratively across those silos. Because right now, if the research is being kind of driven and the research questions being asked or posed from a neurotypical helping service professional perspective, we're not providing services for autistic people in the way that they would like, and those questions aren't necessarily going to be the right ones from my perspective.
Thank you for sharing. That's very interesting to hear about. I can't wait to reflect on that in part 3. Michael, do you want to go next or do you want me to?
I'll go.
Okay.
I actually have participated in some research. I haven't done any research. Actually, over the 20 years or so, I've run some very large groups, like 15 to 20,000 people at least. And we've had polls, and the polls have been very useful and informative. And I've drawn on those in my advocacy. I've actually done, when I was diagnosed around 2000 or so. And one of the ways I was diagnosed was I participated in research at the University of Pittsburgh, at their autism center. And they had a week of intensive research, which who knows how many people I did research for, but it was very intensive, and they couldn't believe. Even then, I think there were problems with them understanding autistic very well, because they couldn't believe how easy it was. You know, they kept saying, "You need a break. You need to do this. You need to do that." You know, I'm like, I just want to get over this. You know, we had a week, and I put it in. I think I shortened it to 5 days because I was so willing to do it. The one thing I did notice is they had a MRI, and that was the beginning of when I saw them really being careful about how they expose autistics to MRI machines in the trauma classes, which really impressed me, because even now there's not that much concern about trauma and autistic as there should be. So of course I've read a lot of research over the years, and I've noticed there's been a very huge trend. My concern is that most of it has been pathology based, and this has been medically based. And this has been on either fixing or understanding autistics medically, and very little about them intellectually or in any sort of meaningful personal way. Their beliefs, their wants, their needs, their desires, their feelings. We're only just starting to do that kind of research, and that's the main issue to me with that we don't yet in research really see autistic as people. So a large part of what I do now in advocacy is to try to humanize autistics any way that I can. I guess that's what I'll have to say for this one.
Thank you for sharing, Michael. Again, I can't wait to share some more in the reflection parts. It's very interesting information. So mine, I wrote down notes because like I said, I have a ton to say about this. My history with research, I have conducted research and I've consumed loads of it in the, various university settings that I've been in. I also did, as I don't know how many of you did, just like the random undergrad, I did psych for my undergrad. And so like part of our coursework was you could get extra credit for participating in the research that the students were doing. So I did those, but it wasn't anything, it was always kind of different. Like we watched a movie and ate popcorn. It wasn't anything like really invasive. I have conducted research both in broader, more mainstream psychology and using single subject design. In graduate school, I feel like we were trained in a forceful, almost blinding way about the value of research and the necessity of doing it in a certain way, focused on really heavily on single subject design. Of course, there is a major advantage of research, and science gives us that objective way of knowing and understanding phenomena, and we can demonstrate functional control to develop more effective interventions if we're looking at the right things. There's tons of great things I could say about research that we learn, but we learn all of that. We're taught those things in our coursework and our field work at our jobs. So I don't want people to think when I go through this laundry list of things that I don't value research. I don't disagree with the necessity of research, but there's just various things that over the years, like reflecting on what I've done with research or been asked to do that I think needs to be discussed, and we need to be addressing these things for reasons that have come up already in both what Michael and Cailey shared. So here's my list. And I'm sure it's longer than this, but these are the points I'm going to make for tonight. So the first one that came up for me when I was doing my doctoral research and when I was just attending classes is who are we conducting the research for? Are we conducting the research for the populations we serve, or is it to benefit someone's research line? And what happens after the research ends? My first exposure to this was at OSU when we interviewed folks from a community that was subject to a lot of research projects. The community was lower income, and it felt like being taken advantage of. Of course, they will allow research. They need all the resources they can get, is the kind of mantra that seemed to be going. The people that we interviewed from that community indicated that researchers never asked what they needed and were never concerned about what happened to the community when the research and interventions were done. So that was one of my first red flags about what's going on here? Why is this research actually being conducted? Another concern or thought that came up for me was during my dissertation and even just participating on a few research projects as an assistant, I became frustrated very frequently because I could see for certain participants that different procedures would work better or prerequisite skills were missing, but we couldn't address those things because they weren't part of the procedures. And rather than pull the learner from the study, we would just continue because we needed the participants. And the learners these were learners who had a lot of skills to acquire. They were usually middle school or high school aged, basically had been in a babysitting type classroom where they weren't really taught a whole lot for years. So we were essentially wasting their time by using these ineffective procedures just to benefit the research studies that we were trying to complete. A few years ago, I was beyond disgusted with some of the research that was being conducted in our field where they created problem behavior. It wasn't dangerous problem behavior or anything like that, but for the sole purpose of conducting a study, they like trained a certain response in a group of individuals with disabilities just in an attempt to try to prove that newer, more effective and humane analyses that were being published by other researchers were false. So this was solely to try to disprove someone else's research. They took a group of individuals with disabilities and wasting their time. I did a whole podcast episode on that, so I'll post that link in the comments. The fourth thing that came up for me over probably the past 3 years when I've gone to our conferences and attended presentations on the research that's being conducted, I see a lot of presentations where the most restrictive extinction-based procedures are being used. And there was zero discussion about working with the participant to come up with procedures or any attempt to fully understand the contextual variables and the needs of the learner before implementing the research protocol. So to me, that really weighs heavily on people are just doing research to do research and not really focused on the actual individuals that are part of the research. The last one here is my longer one, but basically this year I've had several new areas to consider that have been brought up for me, both with my discussions with autistics and in attending talks on colonial research practices. I'm going to quickly go over this, but our podcast episode that just came out today, I talk about this as well in there. So some of the questions that I've been thinking about with research, at what point does research equal facts? Because that's something I see thrown around a lot, especially on social media right now. Does one study with 3 children where very few details are presented equal facts? As a science, shouldn't we constantly be engaging in philosophical doubt and analysis and trying to improve upon our understanding of a phenomenon? To me, that would mean research is an attempt to engage in a controlled understanding of variables and events. And I think we might need might need to be more stringent about how we move from research to facts. Then we go into this whole idea around the colonial research practices that I was talking about. Dr. Malika Pritchett and Dr. Shala Alai have been presenting some wonderful information about this and looking at does our research actually work with the participants being served? If the participants that we're serving are trying to tell us that the research we're doing is harmful, shouldn't we adjust that research and change it? Is that really the kind of research we want to be conducting? So one of the things that I really liked, Dr. Pritchett did a presentation for Uncomfortable X this year, and she talked about how to safeguard against colonial research practices. And she suggested using collaborative research practices instead, ensuring that you're promoting inclusion, amplifying voices, that you're preventing exploitation and further marginalization of persons with vulnerabilities. She indicated we need to have a paradigm shift in science and practice and really look at how we can engage multiple perspectives and work together. And even if we have conflicting values and actions, work to discover and create a unity of values so that we can diffuse dichotomous, imbalanced power differentials. So I kind of rambled there at the end, I think, even though I had notes because my thoughts about this are all over the place. But those are some of the things around research that have come up for me. And that's not even touching on the lack of research for certain things that people still do in our field and say there's a ton of research for, or looking at things that we think are that I would have read a research study as a grad student and been like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. And then I've had the pleasure of interacting with Michael and a few others that are like, well, have you thought about this though? Have you looked at this perspective? And it's like, no, I didn't think about that. So yeah, that's me. I did not watch Facebook Live during any of this, so I don't know if we have any comments. Nope, we don't. For those of you who are watching, feel free to comment and chime in if you have any thoughts or questions for us. If you have your own things that have come up for you around research that you would like to share as well, we'd love to see your comments. We're hoping to have the discussion amongst the three of us, but we also want to engage with the community as well. Okay, so next question is part 3, basically just reflecting on what each of us have said. So you can point out things maybe that if I said something that you don't agree with, or something that's new that like one of us said that you want to reflect on, anything you want, just reflecting on what each person said. So do either of you want to go first?
Sure.
Michael?
I think that everything you talked about is important. I think I've actually had some links I'm going to dump into the chat in the Zoom. I need to get to your live feed.
Yep, I'll put them on the live.
Okay. Which are about the same topics that Megan was talking about, and the same ones that we've all been talking about. What I think has happened is that there's what concerns me, what really concerns me is there seem to be two groups fighting each other, the autism community and the autistic community. And the autistics are very clear about what they think and feel about what's going on in terms of how they're being supported. And I don't think that the autism community is really listening to that and really taking that into consideration. I think part of what we're doing here is trying to combine those two communities to some extent and get some understanding between both of them. Because the way it stands now, the way that we're interacting is much more hostile. You can see that actually happening in the research. You can see that some of the research is literally hostile to autistics, and they feel it that way. We feel it that way. You know, when you're looking for a cure for autism, when you're looking for a cause for autistic behaviors that are otherwise innocuous, we feel those personally inside, and we internalize those even. And it affects our self-image and our image of the world and our ability to trust people. So I think there is a very strong connection between the kind of research you do and the way that you support the people you're doing the research about. And I think that what really makes me happy is that I'm seeing more and more of these kind of things like we're having right now, where we're trying to make these, grappling with these really hard problems and trying to make some headway and some solutions. I'm going to add those links now.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I'll put them in the chat. Do you want to go next, or do you want me to?
Sure. I agree, Michael. I think we're at kind of a turning point in terms of like a real paradigm shift, honestly, in terms of what kinds of questions people are asking and who is really at the table when the research is being discussed and proposed. Megan, something you said as well related to, I don't remember exactly what it was, but was making me think about research traditions and how I don't know about everyone's program, but in my program, I did a ABA master's, and it was the only research I really learned how to interpret was single case design. And I think that a lot of behavior analysts, or at least a lot of people that I have interacted with, and myself included, before learning some different things, have a tendency to really only consider single case research facts or research when there are a number of different research traditions that can provide information and create knowledge. I think especially behavior analysts tend to look away from more qualitative types of research. And one really, I think, awesome way forward is to utilize participatory action models of research. So including folks for whom the interventions and services are supposed to be for at the table at the time of designing the research, so that you really know that the questions you're asking are helpful for that community. And I thought when you were talking about anti-colonial research practices, I think that it's all related, right? I think in a way, when service providers are deciding what is right for disabled people, neurodivergent people, that's not okay, right? I think if we say it that way, it's pretty clear we should have autistic people leading the way in terms of what is going to be best for those folks, right? That's what I think, at least. And then also being open to the fact that there are lots of ways of knowing, and we do have these research traditions and they are amazing tools. And what are some other ways that we can gain information too, and just continuing to be open-minded is what I'm learning to embrace as a behavior analyst.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions if we end up having time, because so far we haven't had a whole lot in the Facebook chat. So I'll do my reflections first and then we'll see. So one of the things that I was reflecting on that you said, Cailey, was that like the not talking to one another. So like there's disability studies where there's research happening there, but then there's these other fields that are doing research as well, and they're not, engaging with one another. It kind of makes me think of all, the things you hear about like research to practice gap. And I honestly think it's a practice to research gap, but that's just my opinion. But it just made me, think about that. I honestly hadn't that's something that's never even crossed my mind that would be a thing. And now that makes so much sense about like why you see there is research that exists on some of these topics that are coming up in our field right now, but we're not aware of it because we haven't been looking in those spaces, and they haven't necessarily been looking in our spaces either. I don't really know. It's possible maybe they've tried and we've rejected them. I'm not sure. But so that really, I really thought about that. And then of course, Michael, it wasn't necessarily new. And now 6 months ago, it probably would have been for me. But when you were mentioning, not considering autistics as human and seeing like the humanity, and looking at, it's something to cure, it's something to solve, and it's a puzzle and all of that kind of stuff. I think hopefully for anybody who's listening to this, that you really listened carefully when Michael was talking about that. And I know my initial reaction would have been to be defensive about that. Like, how could you say that we don't see you as humans? But when you really sit down and just really read any one of our articles, almost every single one, you could probably read it and find parts of it where you're like, that doesn't quite seem the way you would treat someone if they didn't have a disability, right? Like if they didn't have a diagnosis of some sort. Would you go with with your, especially if you have your own children, like, is that something you would have done as like a first line type of, and some people might, but most of the time, not so much. So, and I do think like, especially in our graduate training, a lot of stuff is normalized. So we get to the point where we don't even realize that. And that's a big thing of what happened for me. Cause it's presented in this, like, isn't it amazing that we were able to accomplish this with these folks? And it's like, you go in there and you're just like so eager and excited to like help and save and do all those things. And then when you actually like really let yourself dive in deep and like be open, like you were saying, to various perspectives, it's like, oh, if I flip my perspective and I read this as someone who would have a diagnosis of being autistic, oh, maybe it doesn't come off as positive as I thought it would, So I know that was a lot of reflections, but those were some of the things I was thinking about.
Can I say something about that?
Yes.
The main thing that I have a problem with ABA is that it tries to rush things, and I have this problem with general education and special education too. They want things to happen in a time frame that most people can't fulfill, and that's part of the humanity I'm talking about. Being able to recognize the place that the person you're helping is at, and then help them get to the place they need to be or want to be, but without interfering with their natural processes. And I think, to me, a lot of what ABA does is interfere with natural process because it's effective. Wow, we did it, eureka.
Yeah, but there's also not necessarily a consideration of like at what cost. So like it might work in that little moment, right? But like if the natural process wasn't fully acquired or it wasn't functional, in your 16-week research study, it may look great, but what's happening like a year down the line or 5 years down the line.
Right, exactly.
And
We
again,
need to look a lot more into how what we do affects adults, how much it actually helps the adults. Because even if it looks good for kids, you know, you can't use the same standards you use on kids on adults. The world is totally different. What are you saying, Cailey?
no, I mean, I completely agree. And talking about, you know, I've seen this a lot in my practice as a behavior analyst, is not folks not being developmentally informed. Just because a procedure works, why is it necessary that a person needs to respond in this specific way at 2 years old, right? Why do we have to expect 0 tantrums at 2 years old? That's really kind of absurd if you've ever interacted with a 2-year-old in any capacity. But also, what you just said reminded me of something you said earlier, and how all of the research, or a lot of the funding for research is focused on, you know, ideology or cause or cures and whatever. But if we really understood autistic cognition patterns and differences in cognition and processing, and like if we really understood those things and research was focused on understanding neurodivergence, then I think we would be in such a better place to, you know, create optimal education environments and, you know, really make sure people are thriving in their developmental trajectory. But we're not thinking. A lot of professionals aren't thinking along those lines, I think.
Yep. And I come back to, I don't know if I'm simplifying it too much, but like when people have a physical disability, they understand what's going on there and they create supports to like move through that. So like, why does the same thing not happen for other types of disabilities? It's baffling to me. Like they wouldn't, I mean, I guess there are, like, especially for being paralyzed, there's people trying to study how to like help the body move on its own again or whatever. But that's something I have a few friends who are paralyzed and they would love for that technology to exist. So that's something they're asking for. But anyway, we have several people watching on Facebook, but everybody is very quiet. I'm excited that y'all are listening, but doesn't anyone have any thoughts or questions? Feel free to share. We're on for another like 25 minutes. So feel free to chime in. Before I ask any questions, Michael or Cailey, is there anything else you want to talk about that you haven't mentioned yet?
Oh, I'm sure. I did have a thought, but I think I've lost it, so that's okay. Might come up later.
Michael?
Well, if you want to talk about ABA and specifically, I'm trying to not to criticize it too much, because I know that creates a defensive reaction. I'd rather people were learning rather than closed-minded. But one of the things that I've noticed in ABA is a lot of the research is single subject research. And, you know, while that's fine, like if you're raising a kid or something, if you're going to be applying that to other people, that's not how that works. You know, autistics, one of the big thing we have to get over is seeing autistics where we used to. So much has changed in the last 10 years or so. That you know, people who haven't kept up with that really don't understand autism and autistics that well, compared to what we do now. And so because of that, I think there's a lot of feeling, you know, that you can apply things broadly across many different autistics. And that's almost never true. It's almost always individual cases. But those individual cases have a small overlap. And what we don't understand, I think what we need to learn better by understanding autistics better is what part is overlapping and what part is not. And I think that's where a lot of what we're lost in, especially in ABA.
Yeah, and we're not, those kinds of variables aren't reported in the studies either. So, you know, I've worked with hundreds of children and I've seen different profiles and trying to understand, you know, how they interact with the world and perceive things as best as I can. And I can sort of create these little like subgroups. And I've developed as a practitioner things that I'll come up with based on those subgroups, but none of that's in the research. And if I wanted to find any of that, the closest is that I've seen is that Shriebman did an article like years ago looking at they reflected on the pivotal response interventions and went and like combed through all of their data to see which of the like learners responded to that intervention. And of course, from the more looking at it from an autistic perspective, we could also go down the route of arguing like if that was even truly effective in the ways, but based on their own, analysis of the outcomes and whatnot, they were able to identify certain skill sets where if the learners came in with if they were spontaneously engaging and if they were playing with toys, then based on their outcome measures, they made more progress compared to the learners who didn't. But that begs like a ton of questions. Like it brings up a lot more than it answers. But that's the only one I know of, at least in like the behavior analytic realm, that's even attempted to try to understand like why certain trajectories, would happen or not.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Just checking to see if we have any comments yet.
Yeah.
I'm somehow getting worse at multitasking on Fate. Like I used to be able to watch the comments really well, and now I just can't for some reason. But nope, we still don't have any comments.
They're still thinking, processing.
Yes.
I have a quick thought while we're waiting. So just, we were talking about the silos earlier of disability studies and then the helping professions. I think we don't even, I know that we don't even collaborate across the helping professions, right? I think ABA stays in their own little silo and OT in theirs and education in theirs. Sometimes there's some collaboration between like education and ABA or education and speech or something like that. But I think one of the biggest questions we need to ask ourselves as researchers, if you are a researcher, if you consume research, if you implement research in your practice, you should, is why we need an intervention for something at all. Is a need able to be met through an accommodation instead? We don't always need to intervene. And I think one of the easiest examples or most tangible examples is like the concept of like desensitization, tolerance. Often when you're teaching tolerance, I don't want to say all the time, I never want to say all the time, but often when you're teaching tolerance, that really is a question of who is this for? Is it really for your student or is it for others in their life who are going to have an easier time or feel better about the situation if this kid is able to tolerate a certain situation? Can we accommodate instead? And I think we focus a lot on intervention, but what we really have is a tool for analyzing the environment, right? And when is an antecedent strategy an environmental modification or accommodation just fine? And can we have a mindset shift around that as a field, maybe?
That would come with help understanding autistics better, because I don't know an autistic who doesn't have to make what would be considered unusual accommodations just to live their normal adult lives. So I think we need to be able to understand that autistics live like autistics and that they will be needing to learn a bunch of accommodations and require a bunch of accommodations from the people around them, and that we can't replace those as a child with ABA.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, and is that an area, my own ignorance, is that an area in like disability studies or anywhere else that there is research published on? I know I'm slightly familiar with some of like self-advocacy things for teens and adults, teaching them to sort of speak up for themselves. But in terms of especially helping to navigate from like a really young age, whether an accommodation or intervention is needed, and like what are some potential like menu of items to consider for accommodations for people that don't understand autism yet, like learning it faster. I know there's tons of resources, like different websites and things where people have graciously shared their own experiences, and I think that's a great starting point. But I'm not familiar with anything more formal, which a lot of people are going to want those types of things to exist.
No, I don't know. I think they're just barely starting to study something.
Yeah.
I think this is, I mean, PSA, come do research. Exist. There's grants available. There really are. You can let me know. There's spots available.
Well, somebody, that was the one comment we got from Julie.
Yeah.
She said, we need funding for this.
There's
So
funding.
reach out to Cailey.
Reach out to me if you want to move to a new place. But I think that's the disconnect. That's like the siloing that's happening. We're talking about what the issues are over here, and we're not translating that. We're not taking that information and translating it into practice. And that's why we don't have like, okay, we'll do this instead. And because the issue always comes back to like funding, we have that barrier of being able to implement services as they're funded. We can't just go rogue and do whatever we want. We can like, operate on the periphery and do the best we can, but we still have to operate within the systems that exist. And I think that's what's really cool about participatory action research. I think that we need more people. Maybe this is turning into a PSA and that wasn't my intention. I'm very sorry. But we do need more people contributing to that sort of research that is asking different questions, that is proposing alternatives, because ultimately that's what's going to shift the entire paradigm in terms of funding, in terms of what services look like in schools and ABA. And it even comes back to like the assessments, because there are issues with outcome measures too, right? We look at like NBBIs, who a lot of people, naturalistic developmental behavior interventions, a lot of people look to as, positive alternatives to more traditional discrete trial teaching models that people in disability studies and disability advocates have some concerns about. But even in NDBIs, we still have some outcomes that are related to reduction of stereotypy or stimming. So I think these types of research models where we're incorporating the perspective or the standpoint of the people that are being served, so autistic people in this example, would help guide those outcome measures. It's not just neurotypical professionals who are like, I know what's best because I have the training. You do, but you're not autistic, so you don't know what is best for an autistic person's life. So yeah, the answer is no. I don't, not that I'm aware of. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I would be really happy to hear about that, but we need a lot more research.
Yes, we do. We have a question on Facebook. I'm going to share one thing real quick, and then I'll go to the question. When you were talking about the participatory research, why is that so hard to say? And the outcome measures, one of the things that I've been working on and hope to start doing some stuff with in 2021 is looking outside the field. And I've been looking at just some of the general like parenting and social work things that exist. And there's so many better measures that look at things like, how much power do you feel you have in your life? And I know it doesn't, like, it sounds a little different from a behavior analytic perspective, but I think looking more at like broad repertoires of like, how's your life going? And like, what kinds of things, like, are you able to exist as you, is really in, like, I just think that that's the direction we need to be going in, instead of looking at, again, the symptom reduction and all that kind of stuff. One of the other things that someone connected me with recently that's designed for babies, but apparently has existed for a really long time, is called RIE parenting. Are you all familiar with that at all? RIE. It's responsive infant education is what it stands for. But Martha Gerber designed it, or like started talking about it like in the 60s or something. But I read the description in there and I'm like, this is exactly what we need to be training people to do. It's like, get to know your baby for who your baby is, be responsive and observe your baby and join them in whatever they like to do, right? And it's like, if we could just teach people to do that for all people at all ages, it'd probably be really good.
It seems like that's a lot of what the autism interventions are about. It's not making the kid conform to the parents and making the parents conform to the kid. And
yeah,
I guess one works a lot better than the other one. So.
Yep. All right. So here's our question.
Okay.
It says, I think about systematic desensitization a lot from an ethical perspective. In terms of modifications rather than direct intervention, how might that look? As an example, such as difficulty using public restroom due to toilet flushing, dryers, etc., would the suggestion be noise canceling headphones as an accommodation? Would that be like one possible way to address that without using desensitization?
Well, I mean, I know a lot of people who just avoid using public bathrooms. You know, and they can usually get away with that. If they absolutely have to, they'll go into them. And I think that's part of what it is. You know, that's why humans work. You know, they have motivations that change. You know, if I don't really need to go, then I'm going to avoid that bathroom. If I really got to go, even if it traumatizes me, I'm going to go and I'm going to deal with it. And that's the real world. And I think that's what we should be teaching autistics, how to function in the real world.
And I think that's left out quite a bit. Like those conversations don't happen, right? It's just, oh, he needs to use the public restroom. And
Right.
there's some sort of either forcing, which is the worst of the things, or more of like a systematic desensitization where hopefully it's not as aversive, but it could still be aversive.
My special earplugs I put on just for the bathroom or something.
Yeah. Right. It's like you could sit down and do some like actual instruction and discussion around like, hey, when we go out, we need to come up with a plan. Are we holding it? Do you want your earphones? Like, let's have it. And I think sometimes like what I've seen a lot is especially for people who may not talk, you know, with full sentences, may have different communication devices and things. There's like assumptions made that you can't have those types of conversations or try to explain things. And it makes me so sad. Like there's thousands of humans existing with just kind of going through their day and nobody's ever really talking to them or explaining anything to them.
And how will they ever get to the point of being one of those people who talks to them and explains stuff if you never interact with them?
Exactly.
You always have to give them the chance. You always have to make them feel included, for that matter, because they're real people.
Yes.
I was just thinking something, I forgot it. Anyway.
Cailey, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I kind of lost it, but I'm going to try. So I think two things related to just what would you do instead? I think it's case by case, right? I usually work with an OTs that I collaborate with to help choose something that would be effective. I would incorporate, you know, the client, have them choose. And I like to give the disclaimer too that like, it doesn't mean that any of these things are never appropriate. I had a client once that was moving across countries and like had to go on a really long flight and was afraid to go on the plane. So we did, you know, work on getting used to the idea of being on a plane because he didn't really have a choice. But most of the time, that's like a really rare situation, right? Most of the time, I know people that don't go to the grocery store and prefer to order their groceries. We have tools for that. There's no reason they have to learn to tolerate a grocery store if they don't like it. Unless it's completely necessary for their life and they're moving to a different country across the ocean. Accommodations and environmental modifications and even just skipping the thing altogether is probably okay. I forgot again. If it comes to me, I'll let you know.
What I was trying to remember was that I think part of this is also your world experience. I mean, if you've never known anyone who avoid the bathroom, which is not an unusual thing for people, you know, you may think, oh, well, that's not something that we want an autistic doing. You know, but if you know that there are people who do that and it works out fine, and you know, they handle it the way that works best for them, and they're great people, then you don't really have a problem with that anymore. So I think part of what I've noticed in ABA is it catches people very young, teaches them a bunch of stuff that they feel like they've got this like magic powers now. But they never get that world experience to understand how much diversity is out there. They always apply these very restrictive, maybe even naive standards to other people. And it can't work when you're working with people who are as unusual, divergent as autistics or other disabled people. That I don't see how to solve, but I think that's another one of the big issues, not only in ABA, but intervention in general, and even in research.
I think to solve it, it would take a huge shift in understanding our role our role, intervention role, research role, and what we were talking about earlier of like really existing to, you know, support that development of the person as they are, and identifying like what are those tools, like what does that look like, you know, what are you measuring then, what are your tools, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think like some of the tools and the outcomes that we use are more based around trying to demonstrate that like I was successful. Like I was successful at teaching you 20 things on this checklist, right? As opposed to like what growth occurred for this, you know, human, that we had expanded their life opportunities, and like gave them skill sets that will benefit them into the future without changing who they were or are.
I just remembered what I was going to say. So it really is like normalizing the concept of lots of different ways to exist in the world. And I think maybe it would help people frame this to think about like other cultures. People have all different sorts of People have all different sorts of ways of doing things every day. Like everyday things that you do in your life, someone somewhere else or in a different culture might do it completely different to you, and they still get it done, right? Just because this is the way you do it doesn't mean it's the way this child has to do it, if that helps to frame it for people.
Yes. And that's another thing that kind of like I've noticed, it's been very fascinating to me in our field how welcoming of diversity we are in certain ways and how unwelcoming we are in other ways. And but even with working with clients, like I'll have, or my own husband, you know, comments made about like, well, it's supposed to be done this way, like those shoulds, like it should be done this way. And it's like, yeah, because that's how you do it. That doesn't mean it's not right or wrong. Like you could still do it a different way. All right, we have one more thing for the Facebook chat, and then we'll do our closeout. So the question is, what are some questions we could ask ourselves to help inform our decision making, maybe create a decision making tree, when we're looking at identifying if we need to intervene or identify a support, select an accommodation. So that's kind of a more involved one, and that might even be like a future talk we do, but do you all have any suggestions off the top of your heads?
Not off the top of my head. What I would encourage people to do is explore what exists in disability studies, disability justice, what folks are already writing about kind of the perspective to take in terms of supporting autistic kids, and then start to form those questions. I think the answers that I have are based on learning in those sorts of spaces myself. So that's what I would encourage folks to do first, is just expand their horizons in terms of what they're reading. We can recommend books and things like that, but yeah, that's my thought.
I mean, I think that where it falls down in most of the intervention that I've seen for autistics is how is this going to produce a happy and healthy adult? I mean, again, you have very different standards for a child than you do for an adult. Just something like shaking your hand, you know, you don't expect a child to shake your hand in any way, even similar to the way an adult would. If they just put out their hand and shake it, it's great. With an adult, you know, you're measuring strength and grip and duration and all these other factors. And it's the same with everything we do for kids. How is what we're doing now going to help them function better and to be happier and healthier themselves as adults? I think that should be probably the first question.
I love those recommendations. The thing that comes to mind for me, and this might be sort of a weak answer, but and I'll disclaim this, I'm not working with clients right now because I'm mostly doing these types of things. But if I did have a client in front of me, and I guess partially what I do with my own son too, one of the things I'd be looking at is getting into that, like the happy adult piece of it, happy child in that moment too. Not that like children are going to be happy 100% of the time, but in this moment, based on the different variables that exist and what's happening, does it is an accommodation something that, maintains like a happier status and like you can navigate things with that accommodation, versus like, if I have a learner who's engaging in like a lot of fight or flight, habitual, immediate respondent reacting to something. And we've tried adding a variety of accommodations and that's not helping. And then it's causing more stress for them. What needs to be done to help decrease that stress? And it might be a variety of things. It might be some accommodations and some intervention, but that's kind of what I've been looking at a lot more lately is like how much stress is happening. And especially if there's accommodations we can add right now that like lessen that stress and lessen that stress response while we work on building additional skill sets so that when they maybe go into environments where those accommodations just aren't existing, that they won't have as much of a stress response.
I have a quick thought, if that's okay.
Yes.
No, we're
fine.
Short on time, but yes. And I think we've kind of normalized as a field that it's okay for kids to experience high levels of stress if they're learning, that they're working
like the
through
worst way to learn.
Yeah, like if you look at, I mean, I didn't really talk about my background, but I started in early childhood education and then did my bachelor's in psych and sociology and then ABA and I'm back in education. But if you look to like early childhood education, they're not forcing kids to work through these really heavy emotions all day long for the sake of learning. That's going to be considered the opposite of what's helpful. And we've really normalized it as a field, like, oh, it's okay, it's working, they're learning. Why are they learning like that? Of course, sometimes people get upset, but it shouldn't be happening every day. And
for hours.
For hours, and then something is probably not right. Sorry to say it.
Yep.
That's how I feel.
Well, I appreciate both of you having this discussion. I know we kind of talked about like a broader array, I can't talk right now, of topics and all around research, but I really appreciate your insight and learning from your different perspectives. Before we close out, I would like for each person to share if there's anything you would like to see people who are watching this or listening to this do with this information. So what's an action step that you would encourage folks to take? We already had, Cailey, you mentioned, looking into disability studies and just trying to start understanding the research and the work that's being done there so that you can broaden your perspectives and understanding. That's fine if that's your takeaway. I'm not trying to take that from you. But I did want to remind people that you did mention that already. So do either of you want to share first?
I think that my main thing is that people just need to interact more in a meaningful way with autistics, engage with autistics and find out what they think, find out what they feel, find out how they see things, find out how they feel about things. And do this with adults, find out how the adults are, find out what kind of needs they had as kids, find out how what you're doing connects to their happiness as adults and what you could do differently. And engage with the autistic community more if you can too. There are easy ways to do that, simple, easy ways to do that. Like just joining a Facebook page, like Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, and reading their book and being involved with that. You can learn so much just from that one little thing.
What was the Facebook page? Thinking Person's Guide?
I'll link it right here.
Okay. I think I have that one. I'll link it to when you put it in there. I forgot I followed that one. I don't know why I don't see stuff from them. I'll have to look into that. Cailey?
Yeah, totally agree. Continue to engage, expand your horizon in terms of learning, follow different pages if you want to learn passively to start, but do challenge yourself to engage in conversations with people. I know it can be difficult, but just go in with an open mind and try not to get defensive, right? We know that there are some challenges in the field and that we're not necessarily doing things right. So go in with that mindset and see what's there for you to learn. What is here for me to learn? And then also remembering, who is this for? I think we tend to see our families as clients as well as the kids. And of course, parents or guardians, and they're a part of the conversation too. But if all of your programming is designed to help the families, maybe, and not necessarily around the kid and their needs. Maybe we need to rethink things. So who is this for? And I also encourage you to get involved with research if you are interested in that sort of thing, because we really need it.
Does the program that you're in, what's the program in Oregon that you're in?
It's a multi-university grant collaborative between University of Oregon, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Purdue. And there are spots available at all 3 universities right now. So if you're interested, you could ask me, you could reach out to any of the professors involved, but let me know if you're interested. There are spaces.
Excellent.
It's a special education program though, focused on diversity and autism and equity, and it's a cool group of people.
That sounds amazing. Okay, well, thank you both for participating. I don't have anything to add action item wise. I think we've pretty much covered it. The only thing I'll throw in there is when you're having these conversations and you're engaging, nothing you haven't heard me say before, but be curious and compassionate and kind and humble. It's not a conversation to have to try to prove yourself right and someone else wrong. That's not going to help with improving our research practices or our intervention practices. So it has to truly be coming from a place of seeking to understand and see how that can inform what you're doing. All right. Well, thanks both. Wow. It's 9 o'clock. It's late. Thank you both for joining me tonight. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun.